If conscience disapproves, the loudest applauses of the world are of little value. John Adams.
Oh, hi. Mr. Lahasky here, and today we'll put a bow on the 18th century by discussing America's first political parties and the Adams administration. When George Washington delivered his famous farewell address, he cautioned the American people against partisan infighting. But by the time a new president was sworn into office, the first American political parties were clearly defined. The first party system arose out of the conflicting views of Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, of course, supported a strong central government and an economy based on manufacturing and trade. Jefferson, on the other hand, wanted to limit the powers of the government and preserve liberty in an agrarian America. The fundamental differences in these visions created disagreements on a wide range of issues during the nation's formative years, and the vitriol intensified during the administration of John Adams. But before we get into Adams, let's ask a big question. Are political parties good for the nation? It's no secret that the United States has become increasingly polarized in recent decades, and our two major political parties reflect that polarization. Research from Pew indicates that in 2020, few Americans said that they have close friends who support an opposing political party. And political analysis indicates that members of Congress are crossing the aisle less and less, literally. It seems that nearly every politician speaks of unity, but few are able to practice it. Is this phenomenon a function of the parties themselves? Have they given us the excuse to tribalize politics and characterize our political opponents as the enemy? Or do the parties serve an important purpose in our democracy by organizing people and advancing new ideas? Let's take a look at the first American political parties and see what light they can shed on the subject. Our first big idea describes the origin and essence of the first American political parties. The first party system included the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties. They were established around Hamilton and Jefferson's competing visions for the United States. In the early 1790s, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were perhaps the two most influential people in America, except maybe for George Washington. And their respective visions served as the basis for the political parties they led. Hamilton's was the Federalist Party, established officially in 1791. Vice President John Adams was also a leading member. The Federalist Party favored a strong central government. Accordingly, they preferred a loose interpretation of the Constitution, which would allow the federal government to grow. They supported Hamilton's financial plan and the national bank. They favored tariffs, which would protect American manufacturing firms and encourage an American economy based on trade. Because of their economic vision, they tended to favor Great Britain in international affairs and advocated for a close relationship between the U.S. and her former mother country. And while Federalists believed in democracy, they preferred it when power was vested in the hands of the educated, more distinguished members of society. Opposing the Federalists were the Democratic Republicans, or the Jeffersonian Republicans. Thomas Jefferson teamed up with James Madison to set this party's agenda. The Democratic Republicans preferred a limited federal government, and therefore favored strict interpretation of the Constitution. They wanted power to be vested in state governments, so as to preserve liberty for the American people and prevent the overreach of the federal government. They favored an agricultural economy and therefore opposed tariffs, which hurt farmers who relied more on imports. The Democratic Republicans believed that banks were avenues for corruption and therefore opposed the National Bank and Hamilton's financial plan. In foreign affairs, the Democratic Republicans were skeptical of aligning with Old World monarchies. They preferred revolutionary France. And whereas the Federalists trusted society's elite to govern, the Democratic Republicans vested their trust in the common man and generally advocated for the expansion of democracy. When George Washington announced he would not seek a third term as president in 1796, it was clear that the election to choose his successor would be a contested one. The parties each nominated a candidate and went to work advocating for their agendas. Jefferson was the obvious choice for the Democratic Republicans. He remained among the most popular men in America. As for Hamilton, he was no doubt the ideological compass for the Federalist Party, but his involvement in a 1792 sex scandal precluded his nomination for president. Instead, Vice President John Adams would carry the Federalist Party banner. The race was a close one, but Adams edged out Jefferson by only 3 electoral votes. As you can see from the map, the vote fell largely along geographic lines. Northern and coastal areas whose economies were more dependent on manufacturing and trade tended to vote Federalist, while agricultural sectors of the West and South went for Democratic Republicans. Indeed, this divide foreshadows a long history of regional disputes in the United States, which actually continues to this day. Candidates from the Federalist Party did well down the ballot in 1796. When John Adams became the second president of the United States in March of 97, his party controlled the White House and both chambers of the legislature. The work of the Adams administration is outlined in our second big idea. As president, John Adams continued trends that began under the Washington administration, including neutrality in foreign affairs and the expansion of the federal government. John Adams and the Federalist Party had their hands full when they assumed power in 1797. The war between Britain and France, which had sparked as a result of the tumultuous French Revolution, was dominating the national conversation. Washington had pursued a course of neutrality, but it was unclear if the U.S. would be able to remain on the sidelines. Late in the Washington administration, John Jay helped to negotiate a treaty with Britain that provided for friendship and trade between the two countries. Jeffersonians, however, were outraged at Jay's treaty, and the French saw it as a violation of their own fragile alliance with the United States. Adams, therefore, inherited a delicate peace with Great Britain and a deteriorating peace with France. This issue was further complicated by the infamous XYZ affair in 1797, during which American diplomats were refused access to French leadership unless they paid a substantial bribe to the French government. This was considered a huge insult to the United States, and when word of it reached North America, Federalists clamored for war against France. In the wake of the XYZ affair, violence between the American and French navies broke out on the high seas. This was an unofficial and undeclared conflict known as the Quasi-War. The Quasi-War only increased the demands by the American public for more drastic action against France. But Adams endeavored to follow the example of George Washington. As a precautionary move, he expanded the size of the United States Army, but rather than deploying that army against the French, Adams dispatched a second diplomatic envoy to France, with instructions to smooth out the conflict. And in the final weeks of Adams' presidency, the venture did prove successful. But while Adams' faith in diplomacy was eventually validated, the president's course had alienated members of both parties. Democratic Republicans were alarmed at Adams' expansion of the army, fearing that it was a sure sign that the government was growing too powerful, abandoning the principles of the American Revolution. Across the aisle, members of Adams' own Federalist Party, including Alexander Hamilton, chastised the president for negotiating with France after it had insulted the United States and opened fire against its navy. Even though Adams was successfully able to resolve the conflict in the end, the actions that he took in the midst of the Quasi-War did permanent damage to his popularity. During the course of the Quasi-War, protests against Adams erupted in Philadelphia, where many French immigrants had settled. To quell this opposition, Congress passed 2 controversial bills, known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which Adams signed into law in 1798. These new laws represented yet another expansion of federal power, and as such they sparked a turbulent backlash that led to a constitutional crisis. This is our third big idea. The Alien and Sedition Acts raised questions about federal authority and emboldened Democratic Republicans who challenged the constitutionality of the laws. These 2 laws were the most controversial of Adams' tenure as president, and they became the central issue of his re-election campaign. The Alien Act established a 14-year naturalization period for immigrants to America. In other words, no immigrant would be eligible for citizenship or to vote until they had lived in country for 14 years. It also permitted the government to deport immigrants for suspicious behavior. The Sedition Act held that citizens or newspapers who spoke out against the government could be charged with treason, one of only 2 crimes in America punishable by death. Together, these laws were carefully designed by Federalists to gag the influence of Democratic Republicans. Many immigrants to the United States became farmers or laborers who identified with the Jeffersonian vision for America. Establishing a long naturalization period prevented the Democratic Republicans from picking up new voters through immigration. Likewise, the Sedition Act criminalized opposition to the government, of which all 3 branches were controlled by Federalists. The act essentially made Democratic-Republican opinions illegal. Of course, there was a glaring problem with the Alien and Sedition Acts. They violated the Constitution. The deportation of immigrants without a trial stands in conflict with the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees the accused a right to due process. And the Sedition Act was an egregious violation of free speech, guaranteed by the First Amendment. It appeared as though America was headed for a constitutional crisis. The federal government was now growing beyond the limits set forth by the Bill of Rights. And so the question became, what can be done about it? Today, the constitutionality of a law is determined by the Supreme Court. But that process, known as judicial review, had not yet been established in 1798. You see, the Constitution doesn't actually say what the Supreme Court is supposed to do. In fact, the Constitution offers no advice on what to do when the federal government steps outside of its legal boundaries. So the Democratic Republicans turned to the states and created 2 documents which challenged the notion of federal supremacy. These documents were known as the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. The Virginia Resolution was drafted by James Madison and passed by Virginia's state legislature. It held that the states should be the ones to determine the constitutionality of a law. The Kentucky Resolution, written anonymously by Thomas Jefferson, took things a step further. It suggested that states had the power to nullify federal laws that were deemed unconstitutional. Early versions of the Kentucky Resolution even suggested that a state could secede from the Union in the event that the federal government attempted to enforce such a law. Oh, and by the way, Thomas Jefferson was the Vice President of the United States when he wrote this. He was essentially encouraging the states to ignore and defy the federal government, while holding the second highest office in that federal government. Now, the Alien and Sedition Acts were eventually repealed, so the states never got a chance to go toe-to-toe with the feds. But these 2 documents were incredibly consequential. They laid the groundwork for decades of conflict over federal and state authority that ultimately contributed to the American Civil War. But more on that later. So John Adams ran for re-election in 1800, but using the Alien and Sedition Acts as fuel, his opponents mounted a devastating campaign against him. Even Alexander Hamilton, a fellow Federalist, wrote a scathing condemnation of Adams. The campaign was particularly brutal, even by modern standards, and it played out in a bitterly partisan newspaper media. One Democratic-Republican newspaper famously asserted that John Adams had a hideous, hermaphroditical character, which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. Meanwhile, Federalists wrote that if Jefferson were elected, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced in America. I guess it turns out that ugliness in politics is as American as baseball and apple pie. Maybe more so. Though the election had to be settled in the House of Representatives, Adams was defeated soundly. Historians agree that Adams was neither a brilliant politician nor an effective president, but his tenure in office is responsible for at least one legacy of paramount importance. The best thing that John Adams ever did for the United States was to go away. He didn't surrender power in death nor for retirement. He did it because the American people, through their Constitution, willed it. Jefferson's election, sometimes referred to as the Revolution of 1800, was the first time power was peacefully handed from one political party to another, an American tradition that has miraculously endured for more than 2 centuries. and one that began with Adams' graceful handling of his own defeat. The peaceful transition of power that has occurred in every election cycle since 1800 is, without a doubt, a marvel of Western civilization. So now, back to the question of political parties. The struggle between the Federalist and Democratic Republicans in our nation's first few decades is not unlike the current struggle between Republicans and Democrats. In both cases, the parties serve to organize Americans with very different visions for the United States. But despite these differences and despite the vitriol that sometimes accompanies them, the parties still play an important role. Parties encourage the creation of a governing majority, but they also give a voice to the minority. When Federalist members of Congress passed laws that restricted freedoms, it was the minority party that mounted a response, pushing for change and eventually gaining power themselves. Certainly, the current divisions in our country seem to fall along party lines, and this makes it easy to blame the parties for our problems. But we should always remind ourselves that partisan politics is not a question of right or wrong. It's not a contest to see who cares about America and who doesn't. If we acknowledge that both sides, despite their differences, are fighting for a better America, a more perfect union, as Adams, Hamilton, and Jefferson did in 1800, then our differences will fuel progress, not destruction. Perhaps there is no better story to close with than that of Adams and Jefferson after public life had ended for both of them. Though they were bitter political rivals as leaders of their respective parties, they found their way back to one another after their terms in office had ended. Jefferson and Adams put their personal feuds aside and became close friends and pen pals as they aged. They maintained this renewed friendship, one rooted deeply in mutual respect and admiration, for 14 years, until they died on the same day in 1826. It was the 4th of July. Next time, we'll open a new chapter in American history as we enter the 19th century with the first Democratic-Republican president. See you then.